can't believe that this is our 8th Advent together. I know, right? Where's all the time gone? I really have nothing new to say. You've heard it all before. I should probably just load up an old sermon from the first Sunday of Advent 4 years ago, because you all remember it, right? And that's right, sure. Because as we enter into this sacred time of Advent, we do so in the anticipation of the Christ child that will be born on Christmas Eve. And we walk towards Bethlehem with Mary and Joseph, reflecting on the words of the prophet Isaiah to open our hearts to receiving this amazing and gracious gift of the babe in the manger yet again. And so we hear the words from the 2nd chapter of the prophet Isaiah that says, that God may teach us God's ways and we may walk in God's paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. God shall judge nation against nation and shall arbitrate between peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and they will no longer learn war anymore. The prophet Isaiah says these words on the brink of disaster. The mighty empire of Babylon are at Jerusalem's gates. And he has watched as they have marched, and he knows exactly what the outcome will be. There will be a whole new generation of orphans. War will break out yet again, and that all too familiar calamity will come to Jerusalem and to the people of Judah. And yet, in the midst of this calamity, the prophet Isaiah still has that flame of hope in his heart that burns brightly. That hope that one day we will use our technology not to slay one another, but to feed one another. That we will end our squabbles nonviolently, and we will allow God to arbitrate our differences. The prophet Isaiah prophesies about the advent of the Messianic age, which is a time when the great loves of God will become front and center in our lives as being God's people. Basically, what Isaiah is telling us is that the old will become new again. And I'm not talking about this latest generation's love of Dolly Parton. Where did that come from? Does anyone? Or the fact that Baby Yoda on The Mandalorian looks like a Furby. Yeah, think about it. So we take these first steps along our Advent journey today, reflecting on what the prophet is lifting up, calling us into one of the great loves of God, a love that cannot be any more profound in the Christmas season, the great love of children. As I was thinking about what it means to have a great love of children, I was reminded of a story that my good friend down at College Station at Friends Congregational Church, UCC, the Reverend Dr. Daniel DeLeon told me a few years ago. His church was on its annual church retreat. Like we go up to Camp Stevens and Julian every year, his church goes to a place outside of New Braunfels, Texas called Slumber Falls. And like most campgrounds, the accommodations are primitive, the food is awful, the bed's uncomfortable, and the walls are paper thin. And Dan and his family were sleeping in what was called one of the quads, which is a cabin with 4 rooms with a kind of a common area in the middle of it. They were in one of the rooms of the quads there at Slumber Falls. He, Stacy, his spouse, their 2 children, Mac and Ruthie, in one quad, and 3 other families in one of the other quads, making up one cabin. And one of the couples in the quad were Lisa and Natalie. And the 2 of them had just adopted a newly minted, barely out-of-the-box infant that they named Marley. Now, I don't know if Marley was named after Bob or Ziggy or the dog from Marley and Me, but this was Marley's very first camping experience. So when everyone went to bed about 11:30 each night, inevitably, about 2 hours later, Marley would wake up wailing. Not just crying, wailing. And did I mention that the accommodations were primitive and that the walls were paper thin? So it didn't matter that Marley was in one of the other rooms of the quad. everyone in the cabin heard Marley wail. And then Natalie was the one in the couple who would normally get up with Marley, and Natalie would try to shush Marley by going, which if you weren't awake by Marley, Natalie woke everybody else up. And one does not bounce out of the dreamscape very easily sometimes. So Dan would come out of his dream world, out of his slumber at Slumber Falls, startled by either Marley or by Natalie, and his instinct would be to immediately look to his own children, Mac and Ruthie, to make sure that they were not the ones who were crying out. Now, Mac and Ruthie are almost teenagers. I've watched them grow up. One is reaching 16, the other one's about 13, and they are smart and caring and kind and dynamic, and the chances of them waking up in the middle of the night wailing at the top of their lungs is pretty slim now. But that was the first place that Dan's heart and mind went when he heard a child cry to his own children. But as soon as he was reassured that his children were okay, then his heart and his mind went to little Marley and to his mom's. The concentric circle widened. And it was Dan's contention, and I agree with him, and you might as well, that we are all hardwired as human beings through evolution to respond to a child's cry. Doesn't matter if you're a grandparent or a great-grandparent, a parent, a really dope uncle, a Sunday school teacher, a neighbor, a coach, or just someone sitting waiting for your check at a restaurant. If you hear a child cry out, it triggers something inside of us. It is a need that we have to respond, to make sure that the child is okay, and that we spur into action to see if there's any way that we can help. And it makes no difference if the child is a blood relative or connected to you in any way, shape, or form. If one hears the sound of a child cry, it can cut through the rhetoric and the rancor of our tribalism. If a child cries out in need, as we adults are debating and debasing each other with our own insults and our put-downs and our apathies and our indifferences, when we hear a child cry out, above all the clamor of spears clashing and bombs exploding, a child's cry can pierce the loudest drum of war. And our instinct kicks in. We remember who we are and whose we are. And we remember who that child truly belongs to. And we stop what we are doing and we focus again on what is really important. Because here's the truth, sisters and brothers. A child's cry can shatter the scales that have built up around our heart and hardened. And a child's giggle and laugh and smile can make our heart grow 3 sizes that day like we were the Grinch. Alice Walker, the great novelist and poet and intellectual, the writer of such books as The Color Purple, among other things, and the inspiration of a movement in theology called womanist theology, has written these words. It is no coincidence, Alice Walker writes, that the Messiah revealed himself as a little baby. What else was going to get us to stop being so selfish and ignorant to the ways that we hurt one another than looking into the child's eyes? God knows, and God isn't stupid. You cannot look into the eyes of a child and say to her that the present that you are trying to construct isn't built on a future that you are dreaming about. The choir just sang a beautiful and powerful hymn, Like a Child. And the words, if you didn't catch it, were, like a child loved with sin, to reveal and to mend, like a child born to pray and to show us a way, like a child who believes Jesus comes. In his book, The Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela spends a great deal of time on how important the love of children is to his country's healing and progress after decades of apartheid. In one of his more famous statements on the matter, Mandela writes, "There is no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way that it treats its children." For Mandela, a robust educational system that every child had access to, a healthcare system that every child had access to, economic opportunity that all the children of South Africa had access to, regardless of the amount of melanin in one's skin, ought to be at the heart of a society's priorities if it's going to call itself just or righteous or Christian. Thank you. This quote by Mandela got me thinking, how is KCC's soul? Are we righteous? Are we just? Are we Christian? So I looked at our budget. How many of you knew that we had published our 2020 proposed budget? 4 of you. Excellent. The proposed budget for 2020 is roughly $584,000. That's such a large number. It makes me scared. But I am proud to say that our care and nurture of children and youth make up 48% of our budget. Between the preschool, our children and youth ministry, and our mission and outreach that is directed towards agencies working on behalf of youth and children, they easily makes up the single biggest area of all of our budget. We put more human, financial, and spiritual resources into our children and youth ministry and outreach than any other aspect of our church. That gets an amen. Why? Because we love them. And we ought to. Have you seen them? They are a wonder, as Barbara said. And we are charged to do so. Loving children is part of the prophecy that hearkens in the Messianic age, and doing so allows us the humble privilege to participate in the advent of God's peaceable realm. Today is the first Sunday of Advent, which is traditionally the Sunday of Hope. It's also December 1st, which means that it's World AIDS Day. And today, finally, some hope has come to the children of Africa when it comes to HIV and AIDS. According to the World Health Organization, 1.1 million children living in East and Southern Africa live with HIV and or AIDS. Let's put that into a perspective that all of us can appreciate. That would mean that every single person living in the city limits of San Diego, California, has HIV and or AIDS. But the good news is that in 2019, this was the lowest number of birth rates of children born with HIV in 10 years. Only 84,000 children were born with HIV. That's still a staggering number, but it is significantly less than what it was 10 years ago in 2010, when 2 million children were born with HIV. Plus, more good news on this World AIDS Day is that 72% of the children living with HIV and AIDS in South and East Africa are what are called virally suppressed, meaning that they front as if they are completely healthy children due to the necessary medications and treatments. What changed? What was the catalyst? The church. Finally, the church jumped on board after years of advocates telling us exactly what the children of Africa needed. Finally, after decades, the church decided to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. For the longest time, and I don't mean to throw our sisters and brothers under the bus, but for the longest time, the Catholic Church and the evangelical institutions took the problematic and dangerous approach of abstinence-only education, which does not work, and prohibition against condoms and other forms of birth control, which does not work. Their only solution was to tell people to behave. Don't do it. Just say no, which we all know just doesn't work. One of the biggest sins, and I mean the biggest sins of the 20th century when it comes to the Christian church, is our response to the AIDS pandemic worldwide. Millions of people died. because of the church weaponizing AIDS against the gay population, against people who are ailing and living with drug addiction, and people of the third world. We need to get down on our knees and beg God for forgiveness. But for the love of children, there is hope today, sisters and brothers. The church is finally starting to work with local communities to be a vital part of the solution. There is still so much to be done, but finally the church has begun to act in earnest. What changed people's minds? The cry of children. Children living with HIV and AIDS were brought from Africa, and they told their story in the middle of congregations. And in telling their story, no longer could Catholic churches and evangelical churches turn a blind eye. No longer was it an issue, but it was a child crying out in pain. People like Rick Warren from Saddleback Church, and Tony and Peggy Campolo, and all three who are leaders of the evangelical world, they pressed business leaders and politicians to fund research and medicines, and we've come a long way. They joined the likes of William R. Johnson and Michael Schumacher here in the United Church of Christ, and a host of other activists like ACT UP and interfaith groups, and celebrities like Tom Hanks. Who can say no to Tom Hanks? And Bono, who we can all say no to, and Lady Gaga, who's amazing. And Dolly Parton. We all know that there are plenty of resources in this world to cover the medications and treatments that are needed by people who are living and dying with HIV and AIDS. And we must put politics and social ideals aside to coordinate and live and work together, regardless of our social and political preferences, to hear the cry of children, which is a higher calling than the way we vote. Because when a child cries out, it is in the very core of our being to respond. It doesn't matter if it's my child, if it's a blood relative. It doesn't matter if I am connected to it in any way. The cry of a child can shatter the scales that have built up around our hearts and hardened. Our instinct when we hear a child cry out, doesn't matter which room of the quad we're in, is to get up and make sure it's okay. Because in the eyes of God, we are all God's children. And today in Africa, more and more children are giggling and smiling and softening our hearts so they can grow 3 sizes bigger, and the Christian church can no longer be a Grinch. For Jesus comes like a child to heal and to mend. Like a child, Jesus comes. Amen.